another edition of the Silverbird Selection, and having recently completed my final game review, it's time for another review comparison video where I take a look at my review scores compared to those of Zap64 back in the day and also the users of Lemon64. So for the final time, let's head over to my computer and do those comparisons. Now I'm presuming if you're watching this that you've seen previous editions of this type of video. It'd be a bit strange for you to just tune in and watch the very last one of these that I do, but just in case, what I do is take a look at the last batch of games I reviewed since the last one of these videos I did, compare the review scores that I did with the ones from Zap and Lemon64 and just see how they compare and have a bit of a look at the reviews on Lemon and things like that. So here are the last 8 games. I did also review the Magnum pack, which was a compilation of 4 games that I'd already reviewed, but 3 of those games don't have any reviews in Zap, so I'm just going to ignore that. It was crap anyway. So looking through this list, it was not a good selection of games, generally speaking, some pretty low scores. So we've got a couple that are less than 5 and then another 4 that were less than 6 and then just 2 that were over 7. So generally speaking, this was a poor selection. This one also includes the Wild Bunch, which was a homebrew version of a game that was originally released by Firebird for the Spectrum and Amstrad. But handily that one is listed on Lemon64, so we can take a bit of a look at that one. So the first of the games I reviewed from this batch was Stunt Bike Simulator. So let's head over to Lemon64 and take a look at that. So here's the Lemon listing for it. Lemon users, 9 users in total, gave it a score of 3.7. I gave this a score of 5.7, which was massively overrated. That was down to the fact that it's got pretty good graphics and music. The gameplay though is completely down the toilet and it got a 2 out of 10 for gameplay from me. So just really nothing in the way of reviewer comments here. Sheldon Cooper, this user, puts the scores from all the magazines on pretty much every listing on Lemon. If you've not seen it, I'm sure you have if you ever visit Lemon64. Very handy. Whoever you are, Sheldon Cooper, thank you very much for doing that, because that's proved really handy in some cases. So yeah, you can see that basically there's no other reviewer comments from Lemon users. It shows here that Commodore user gave this 3 out of 10 and Zap gave it 40%. So let's take a look at that Zap review. So there we go, Stunt Bike Simulator, 40% lack of variety and bad implementation make this poor value for money. Presentation, nothing really to mention there. Graphics, poor animation, bland use of colour and cardboard cutout scenery. I'd say that's actually a little bit harsh, because graphically I thought it was quite nice. It got some parallax scrolling, nice big sprites. I didn't think it was too bad. And then strangely sound, they've given it 76%. Feeble sound effects but nice music. Well, that's true, the music was nice. Still seems a bit high if they're saying there's feeble sound effects, but hey, who am I to argue? And then hookability and lastability, average scores for those as well. The stuntman idea is interesting, but control and time limit are a chore. All 5 stunts involve similar use of a motorbike. Well, this suggests they actually got past the first level, which I never did. I probably played it like 20 or 30 attempts and never got past the first stage. So let's take a look at the reviewer comments. Firstly, this one says, what an absurd game. The silliness begins with a bike driving itself down a road where the rider flies above on a hang glider. Thick or what? This section of the game is also really difficult, requiring pixel perfect positioning to drop onto the bike. That's what I found and never actually managed it. Playing the rest is frustratingly pointless, particularly the hoop level in which the rider does exactly the same thing no matter where you make him jump. I'd say that Stunt Bike is one of that unfortunate breed, the game idea without the game. Yep, that's an absolutely fair review. And then the other comment here says, another simulator from Silverbird. Did they buy Codemasters while I wasn't looking? That's a reference to the fact that there were a number of games released by Probe Software called Something Simulator, obviously trying to cash in on that Codemasters style of game. At least a series of motorcycle stunts is more original than most budget games. It's a shame they're so badly done. All stages are against a strict time limit, which often halted my progress as I came close to stunt completion. Obstacles in all stages come too thick and fast to be avoided much of the time, slowing the cycle on impact. Graphics try hard to be well drawn and the music is good, even if the sound effects are basic. The most fun part of the game is Chad's Superman impression on the fire hoop section as he seemingly flies through the air when he leaps. I never saw that because I never got past the first stage. So yeah, 40% probably is about right, I would guess. Certainly more correct than my review score of 5.7. So moving on, the next game I reviewed was the Wild Bunch, which as I mentioned was a homebrew release for the Commodore 64 based on the game released by Firebird back in the mid 80s. So this does have a listing on Lemon64. It's been given 7.1 from 7 votes. I gave this 7.5, so pretty consistent with the Lemon users that have voted for it. As you can see, it's got the credit there for Cytronic Software from 2009. Not much in the way of comments again. Same Kevin Smith as KTEL, It's Only Rock and Roll. Don't really know what that's in reference to, just that the creator of the original game was Kevin Smith. And someone saying looks like an interesting game, which to be fair it was, considering it was just a text adventure in essence, or something a little bit like the Oregon Trail perhaps. So obviously there was no Commodore 64 review of this because it was never released back in the 80s. So what I'm going to do is look at a review of the game for the Spectrum. This is from Your Sinclair magazine, issue 8, August 1986. As you can see, quite a comprehensive half-page review, which I'm not going to read through in any great detail. I'm just going to go to the summary. And it says, overall, it's a text adventure. Don't look for any wildly exciting graphics. On the other hand, it's an absorbing game. What do you expect for $1.99? I really can't say anything other than I was pleasantly surprised and thoroughly enjoyed my jaunt into the Wild West of the Wild Bunch. And you can see the scores there. Graphics, it's got like 5, playability 7, value for money 10, addictiveness 8, and an overall score of 7. So we'll make that 70% in our final comparison with the other review scores. So pretty much 7 out of 10 from Your Sinclair for the Spectrum version, which is very similar to the Commodore 64 version. And as I mentioned, we've got 7.1 from Lemon users and 7.5 from me. So overall, I'd say that's pretty consistent scoring for that game. Let's move on then, and the next game I reviewed was Freak Factory. I gave this a score of 5 out of 10. Very bug-ridden game. It has loads of problems, sometimes problems loading and also problems loading or firing up different sections of the game. It very often crashes. So anyway, Lemon users gave this a score of 4.1 from 16 votes. And there's a few comments here, so let's have a look at some of these. That's big. I'm not going to look at that one. I'm going to look at Infanta, because Infanta comments quite regularly on my videos, I believe. It might not be the same person, but I suspect it probably is. So he says, creepy game, lab graphics look fine on my copy back in the day, and if you had an autofire joystick you could beat the lab scientists without wiggling the joystick. Okay. Title screen was unusually detailed. You had to actually enter the lift to begin the game. That's true. And after a short period, the Mad Doctor would summon one of his strange Grover clones to shoot you with a Nerf rocket, propelling you to the far right of the screen again. Beyond that, the game was pretty scary as a kid. The faces on the walls were really creepy. If they saw you, you'd lose heaps of energy and it would make a painful screeching sound. They say Zap's review is a bit harsh. It's not that bad, but it's not that good either. We'll get onto the Zap review in a minute. If it looks interesting, you'll probably like it for a while. If it doesn't, you can afford to give it a miss. Wow, there's some really big reviews here. Let's move on. One of the few games I ever finished. I was thrilled. I did enjoy the game, even if the gameplay was a little bit unimaginative. There was a creepy atmosphere about Freak Factory that kept your interest. It's quite positive reviews of this game considering the score it's got. Let's move on. Cool game, very atmospheric with some spooky title music. A shame it was so difficult and must be impossible without a joypad, as the joystick wiggling is way too hard. It's not that hard, it's just laborious really. That's even if you get to that point, because the lab screens quite often crash before you get into them. No one's mentioned about how it crashes though, which is a bit strange. One of the hardest games ever at the time, but I loved it. Never made it to the end though. Me and my father used to play my old C64, especially this game, for hours and hours. I never gave this a chance, and I remember why it stinks. Yeah, I'd more agree with that, to be honest. And then another big one at the end that I'm not going to bother reading. So let's get to the Zap review. Issue 17, September 1986. They gave it 28%, and they called it Freaky Factory in the header there rather than Freak Factory. Obscure instructions make the game unplayable. That's not really true. I think it's quite clear what you do. Graphics, it says 40% blocky sprites and bland backdrops. Can't really argue with that. Sound, a few tunes but none of them are inspiring. Yeah, also fair. Trying to work out how to play the game is off-putting. I don't think that's really true. I think it's fairly straightforward to play, but it's slow and boring. I'd agree with that. And basically the overall score, 28%, they say give it a miss, which I think is fair. Let's have a look at some of the reviewer comments. So here it says, it is beyond my comprehension why companies such as Firebird release this kind of trash. Is there some kind of rule which states that every 5th piece of budget software release has to be mind-numbingly boring? Even at £2 this game is ridiculously overpriced, and I must urge everyone not to touch this, even with a 10-foot sterilised joystick. He didn't like it. Julian Rignall says, oh dear, terrible graphics, terrible sound and terrible gameplay. What on earth are Firebird up to? It must be noted, by the way, that on the same page is the review of Ninja Master, which they also hated. So it says the first section of the game is so slow it's ridiculous, and after playing it for a while you just want to turn it off. The platform part of the game is a little better in comparison, but it's very dull indeed. Don't buy it. Again, it's pretty fair, to be honest. It's not a good game in any respect, and I would say it's playable if you wanted to play it, but the problem that really puts me off is just how buggy it is and the fact that it crashes more often than not. And the final reviewer comment says the main fault with the game lies in the instructions, which are obscure and only give a rough outline of your objective. Again, I found the objective fairly straightforward, so I'm not sure whether they got a version with less comprehensive instructions perhaps. The caverns take ages to get through because the gargoyles rip away your energy far too fast. Well, they can be avoided. Yeah, it's quite clear that that's how you do that, so I'm not really sure why he's making a big deal about that. Platform game is quite fun due to the fact there's a reasonable amount of action. The graphics are blocky and not appealing at all, and the diabolical tune which drones on and on only makes things worse. As I recall it, the tune's only on the title screen, so that's easily skipped as well. So I'd say some of those criticisms aren't entirely fair, but it is overall not a good game. So moving on, the next thing I reviewed was actually Micro Rhythm Plus, which is not a game, it's a utility, and as a result there's no page for it on Lemon and there's no reviews that I could find either. So we're going to move on to the next game after that, which was Star Slayer. I gave this a score of 7.5. I quite enjoyed it, more so than I thought I was going to. And as you can see here, Lemon users gave it 5.7, only 7 votes. A lot of these games didn't get many votes on Lemon. It's not really surprising, they're quite obscure. So just a few comments here. Attractive budget game from Silverbird with some nice music too. The game was rather playable too, collecting the little discs, good fun. Yep, can't disagree with that at all. Flick screen shoot 'em up that's really quite polished for a budget release. However, it's very tough, and despite the changing scenery throughout the levels, the challenge it mounts is samey. Yep, also agree with that. Handily, Sheldon Cooper's put a comment on here saying the Commodore users got a review of it at 5 out of 10, which we'll get onto in a moment because there is no ZZap review of this game. And finally, not a lot to do in this platformer, but the controls are good and there's a little strategy to killing the enemies. It could definitely be a bit more interesting. I'd say all those comments are fair, but overall I still enjoyed the game myself. So let's move on to that Commodore user review in the absence of a ZZap one. So here it is in their cheapo roundup. This is from issue 61, and you can see a few games reviewed on one page here, but here's Star Slayer. So it gives you an overview of the game. I'm not really going to go into that because I've talked about that when I did the review. And it goes on to say this pallid cybernoid clone provides a reasonable blast for 1 or 2 goes, but soon grows tiresome. You're constantly attacked by hordes of scummy types and death arrives all too swiftly if you aren't careful. That's not really fair because that's kind of the point of the game, is you have to have all those relentless respawning enemies in order to rack up the points to progress to the next level. Also, calling it a cybernoid clone is a bit strange because it's a platform run and gun game, not a space shoot 'em up, so that's bizarre really. Those who enjoy mapping are well catered for, and the mindless blasters will have a field day. If you like a bit more substance to your games though, take a gander elsewhere. And they gave it 5 out of 10, which will equate to being 50% to compare it with the ZZap scores. Yeah, that's not really a totally fair review. I mean, it is a mindless blaster to some extent, but it has got a bit more depth than just a normal run and gun type game, so bit of a strange review there, but it is what it is, I suppose. Let's continue then and look at the last 3 games I reviewed in this series. So next up was Halls of the Things, originally by Design Software, although they are showing the Firebird cover there. And I gave this a score of 4.4. Was not impressed at all with this dungeon crawler that was just way too difficult. So Lemon users have given it 7.6 though, so they're impressed generally. Complex controls, so not for people fond of memorising a lot of keystrokes, but pretty fun once you get the hang of it. Don't really agree with that. Me and my mates thought it was particularly amusing the way the main character held his sword at groin level and waggled it. Not that we find that thing funny anymore, no sir. Dave Barker says this game is amazing. It's the only old computer game I've ever done a web search on. That's how good it is. Wow, some people really did like this game and I can't really understand why. I managed to look at the code and there are heaps of funny things written in the code. The guys at Crystal/Design were top of the class in computer games. Trust me, this one will last forever. Well, it will last forever. Doesn't mean it was good though. Another one saying this is probably one of the greatest games ever made. Forget the early specky converted stickman graphics. This is the only dungeon magic 'em up to regenerate a brand new maze every time you play. The result, infinite playability. Be patient, reassign the crappy key presets to your own definition, and by no means use a joystick to play it, and look out for things pretending to be treasure. Yeah, I tried playing it with keys and joystick, and it wasn't any harder really with the joystick, to be honest, so I don't know why he said that. Yeah, lots of people like it, not really sure why, as I said. It's also not the only dungeon magic come up to regenerate a brand new maze every time you play, because I can think of two off the top of my head, both Mastertronic games, which were Master of Magic and Rogue. So yeah, I don't know why he said that, just lack of understanding, I suppose, or lack of experience. Yeah, positive reviews from almost everyone there. As I said, I don't really understand why, but Zap liked it as well, because let's take a look at the review now, and you can see they gave it 88%, an aging but very playable classic. As they've mentioned here, the graphics are poor, dull colours, poor animations, sparse backdrops, not much in the way of sound either. Hook ability, quite hard to get into until you're familiarised with the controls. And last ability, the random dungeon maze designs, changeable difficulty setting, a variety of weapons and action permit a different game each time. Well, all that's very true, except I would say the variety of weapons and action, I just don't get that at all. It was very samey of like walking from room to room, shooting monsters and collecting treasure. It was not really a full-on RPG, it just had some elements of that, and was effectively a very poor looking Gauntlet clone in my opinion. So anyway, let's move on to the reviewer comments, starting with this one here from Julian Rignall. I remember playing this continually on the Spectrum 4.5 years ago, and it's lost none of its appeal since then. Graphics and sound are really terrible, but this simplicity contributes to the eerie atmosphere of being alone against impossible odds. As soon as you're accustomed to the wide range of keyboard controls, the action is frenetic and engrossing. Defending yourself with homing missiles, turning a corner to find a gang of things lurking there, ignore the stickman and basic line drawings. Halls of the things is easy to pick up but extremely difficult to put down. Fair enough, if you say so, Julian. Do not agree in the slightest. Except for the graphics and sound, which were definitely not very good. And the second review here says the appalling graphics of the Halls of the Things disguise an engrossing and challenging game. Presentation is excellent. You're able to redefine most of the game's parameters to cater for all skill levels. Quite baffling initially because of minimal instructions. Get accustomed to the keyboard. Long and rewarding games can be enjoyed. How? Long and rewarding, and literally you're just wandering around a maze collecting treasure and shooting the same enemies over and over again. Sonically it's nothing special. Collecting objects and destroying monsters is a simple format, but achieving the objective is far from easy. Well, that's definitely true. The random dungeon design each time you play the game, it guarantees its last ability. Highly recommended for all who want some classic blasting action. Yeah, I just don't get it. I know lots of people like this game, but I just don't understand why. And now we go from one terrible re-release to another, and Prodigy. Obviously we're seeing the Electric Dreams version here, but it was re-released by Firebird in the Silver Range packaging. I gave this a score of 4.2. Lemon users have given it 4.8, and only a couple of comments again. Title is misleading. Keith Flint is nowhere to be found in this game. Poor Keith. So the one serious comment about this says, anyone know what in Hades you were supposed to do in this? I was willing to forgive the poorly drawn sprites and garish backgrounds if the game played well and was worth exploring. After progressing a little bit into the game, I was killed and sent right back to the start. That was enough for me. Sound effects were crud too. Next. I couldn't sum that up any better myself, really. That's exactly how I felt about it as well. It was hard to play. The graphics were hard to look at, and yeah, it was just terrible really. So we're all in agreement there, and so is Zap, because they gave it 40%. This was the original full price game review. They didn't review the re-release as far as I'm aware. So full page review with a couple of screenshots which look very similar, but then I suppose they would. So presentation 65%, sparse instructions but good in-game presentation. I would say that's fair. Graphics, reasonable definition but unconvincing forced perspective. Again, reasonably fair. I would say probably a little bit overrated compared to what I'd say, but I'm not a fan of the isometric games, as you well know. Sound says fair title tune but little in the way of spot effects. Yeah, again, agree with that. Fiddly control, which is immediately off-putting. Agree. Large playing area if you can be bothered to stick at it. Again, that's true, but it doesn't mean it's any good. Value £10 is a little steep for a monotonous and unplayable game. And finally, they say for the 40% overall, an interesting concept which suffers from severe playability problems. So yeah, they're pretty much in agreement with myself and the Lemon users there. So let's take a look at the reviewer comments in a little bit more detail. Top right we have, here we go again, great concept, bad implementation. Another of those games that fails because too much has been crammed into it. The gameplay, what there is of it, is slow and repetitive, and the graphics don't do anything to encourage further play. Control method is awkward, making the game suffer even more, and trying to make that awful child follow you is near impossible. And when it is mastered, it's even slower than before. I didn't enjoy playing Prodigy, and I doubt it will appeal to many. Yeah, so I agree with that about the baby. That was just really difficult to get him to follow you around. So good old Julian says, this is completely unplayable. It's incredibly difficult to get the baby to follow the spaceman. In some places it requires a pixel perfect move before you can progress. It's so frustrating, and when the aliens start moving around and getting in the way, it all becomes too much. It's a shame. If a little more thought had been put into the gameplay, then it could have been quite good. As it stands, it's no good to man or beast. And finally, in essence, Prodigy is a simple seek it out maze game, a type which I really don't enjoy. I agree, I don't tend to enjoy those games either. The initial difficulty encountered in attempting the simplest manoeuvre rapidly destroys any compulsion to explore, and Nejo is a real pain. If he's not lined up correctly with a door, he just stands against the wall immovable. The lab's defenders are a continual hassle, and you spend most of the time trying to avoid them rather than looking around. Far from the best game of its genre, and unless you're desperate for a forced perspective maze game, I would advise you to look elsewhere. And yep, I think no one can disagree with any of those comments really. So last, and to be honest kind of least, we move on to another isometric game, the last game that I reviewed, which is Chimera. There's a picture of the original packaging in the Super Silver range, for those of you that are interested. So I gave this a score of 5.2. Lemon users a little bit more generous, they've gone 6.2 from 39 votes, so quite a lot of people put a comment or made a vote on this one. A few comments here talking about the death scream when you die. The death scream is pure horror. I shat myself when I tried to pick up a radiator. So yeah, if you try and pick up the radiator, you die and you get that scream. The strange, muffled, creepy in-game sound effects are cool. Well, as I recall it, there's only really the scream and a couple of little sort of bleeps when you pick things up. So moving on, I remember the lovely white box that this came in, cracking Hubbard music once again, a speedy isometric game which was quite unheard of at the time. Game was tough though, and the speech gave it an eerie atmosphere. Good release. I would not really agree with that necessarily. They were talking about the Super Silver packaging obviously, which I just showed. So moving on, comments here say, one of my first games, I was really surprised about the music and the speech synthesizer. Never thought back then that such was possible on a C64. Clearly they hadn't played Ghostbusters or something like that then. It took me a while to figure out how to play this game. The poor character kept dying a lot. Yeah, he does die a lot and very easily. I've actually been able to finish it. Come to think of it, it's probably one of the few C64 games I've ever finished. Well, someone's certainly got very good perseverance and a lot more patience than me there. Furry Poo says, that scream at the start shocked me the first time I played it on our colour TV because we had a green screen monitor with no sound for ages. That's strange. That sounds like it's probably an Amstrad review rather than a Commodore 64 one. I don't know if maybe there was a Commodore 64 green screen monitor, who knows. Anyway, they go on to say, good game, but it got far too samey after a while and it was bleeding hard. Yeah, way too hard. So let's, oh wow, here's a big old comment there. I'm not reading that one. First played this on my buddy's Spectrum and wasn't impressed. Sadly not impressed with the C64 version either. Graphics are good, music is good, etc. But gameplay, yeah, I pretty much agree with those comments. Graphics are okay, music's pretty decent, gameplay not great really. I like this game but never got anywhere, like a lot of other games at the time. Still remember that there were some radiators in some screens and you died instantly when touching them. I was always afraid of losing because of that horrifying scream when dying. Yeah, lots of people talking about the scream. A difficult ISO adventure with some interesting speech in it. The scream curdles my blood every time, I tell ye. So yeah, lots of people, as I mentioned, talking about that scream, which was very well done, and probably if it wasn't the fact that it meant that you died and got to start the game again, would have been one of the more impressive parts of the game. So let's move on to the ZZap review, which was 70% from issue 9, January 1986. Full page review with some colour screenshots. As you can see, it originally cost $3.95. It then was later re-released in the Silver range for $1.99. Interesting screenshot they've chosen there, that green backed room. That's one of the more ugly screens from the game, although maybe they just chose it because the green goes nicely with the green box that the scores are in here. So basically they've said presentation 80%, adequate instructions and neat in appearance, graphics 90%. Wow, 90% for the isometric 3D graphics, that seems generous. Good definition and animation on the main character. Sound 91%, 2 great tunes and some very good speech and FX. Well, the speech is good, the rest not so much, I would say. The tunes are good, sorry, that's not fair. The tune I've heard on the start of the game is decent, but not one of Hubbard's best in my opinion. Hookability 75%, initially absorbing to play a map, and then last ability 61. It does get rather monotonous with 4 very similar tasks to complete. Value for money, an above average game at a below average price. That's just at that point in time, so if they had reviewed the budget one, maybe they'd have been even more impressed with it. And overall 70%, quite simply a good arcade adventure. Well, I would say it's an average arcade adventure with a very high difficulty level. So let's move on to those reviewer comments. Chimera is an interesting game with a fair few problems to solve. Graphics are well implemented and attractive on screen. Where else would they be? One of the best features of the game is the sampled scream sound. Yeah, we love that scream. Everyone loves that scream. It will really scare you the first time you hear it. Problems are a little silly and the plot is a vain attempt to disguise a highly derivative product. Considering the price, however, Chimera is reasonable value for money. More games of this quality at this price would not go amiss. Well, lucky for you, there are about to be a lot more games at this price or even less that were well worth playing. So the second comment here says, this is only the second Nightlore Alien 8 lookalike to appear on the Commodore 64. Silu, one of Firebird's earlier releases, being the first. Oh, I've mentioned Silu before, that's even worse than this game. Chimera is definitely graphically superior and sonically to Silu. The 3D effect is excellent, as are the pieces of music and sound effects. Gameplay is unfortunately just as weak as Silu they're talking about there, so yeah, I would agree with that for the most part. I don't think it's quite as bad as Silu, but still very hard. Having said that, I must profess to deriving several enjoyable and absorbing hours of playing and mapping, helpful but not essential. For the paltry sum of $3.95, Chimera is certainly worthy of consideration. So I think what they're most impressed about at this point is that a game was being released for £4 that was actually got some length and longevity to it. I guess that's the reason why they're particularly impressed by it, rather than the quality of the game itself. The final comments here say, though not entirely original when compared to Spectrum releases such as Nightlore or Alien 8, Chimera is one of the first games of this type to appear on the C64, and very impressive it is indeed. Graphics are exceptional, moving smoothly, convincingly in front and behind the scenery. Game itself isn't bad, some of the solutions are a bit obscure. After a while you fall into the author's thought processes and things get easier. Not a bad release and definitely worth the budget price asked. None of them have mentioned how you have one life and just die and have to get sent right back to the beginning of the game with like virtually no sort of inkling as to whether something's going to kill you or not. That's just crazy, because that's the biggest failing of this game. But there you go, they all seem to quite enjoy it and they gave it 70%. So that's the final batch of review comparisons completed, and as always, the last thing I always do on these videos is to put the games in order from best to worst from each of the 3 sources. So there's mine with my scores, the ZZap scores along with the guest publications, your Sinclair for the Wild Bunch and Commodore User for Starslayer, and finally the Lemon scores. And what I usually do is look at them side by side and compare them, and as is usually the case, mine are very different to the other 2 sources, but the other 2 are actually quite similar, because if you look at the top 4 for the magazines and Lemon, they're identical with Hulls of the Things, Wild Bunch, Chimera and Starslayer. Then you get a bit of a mixed bag further down. Stunt Bike Simulator is a bit higher from the ZZap review compared to the Lemon one. One thing I should also mention is Micro Rhythm Plus didn't get a review in ZZap and it's not listed on Lemon, so that's not being included. I've just stuck that at the bottom just to keep it out of the way. So as I said, my scores are completely different in terms of ranking them compared to the other 2. I have got the Wild Bunch at the top, which compares reasonably favourably with ZZap and Lemon. Starslayer I've got at the top as well, and it's kind of mid-table on the other 2. Stunt Bike Simulator should not be in 3rd place there, it's a terrible game. It was just ranked more highly because of the graphics and sound elements. The gameplay was garbage. Chimera is in the middle. They're all pretty poor really from my perspective. Freak Factory, I guess the biggest difference is Halls of the Things is really low down from my list and it's right at the top for the other 2. I very much disagree with everyone else on that one in particular. Prodigy's near the bottom, Freak Factory's near the bottom. Yeah, they're all kind of all over the place on mine compared to the other 2. That's typically been the case, but if you look at the average scores I've given compared to the averages from the magazines and also from the Lemon users, it's actually pretty close. I've got an average of 5.66. The magazines, ZZap and the other ones have got an average of 5.51, and Lemon's average is 5.6, so actually pretty close. And I think if you took Micro Rhythm Plus out, that wouldn't make much difference anyway, because it's got a score of 5.5, which is right in that average sort of range anyway. So a pretty low average for the final batch of games in this last review comparison video. It's not really ended on a high point by any means. Certainly the last 3 or 4 games I reviewed were not particularly good from my perspective, and also from the perspective of Lemon and Zap, apart from Halls of the Things, which, as I've said, I don't really understand why everyone seems to rate that so highly, but they do. So there we go, that's the end of these review comparison videos. I hope you've enjoyed watching them. I wasn't too sure about doing them in the first place. I think it was a suggestion from a comment on one of my early videos about perhaps comparing my scores with the ones from Zap, and it's turned out to be quite fun, generally speaking. I've enjoyed looking through the old magazines and seeing the review scores, and also looking at things other than Zap and seeing what they thought of some of the games when I've needed to. So I'll definitely be incorporating looking at old computer magazines into future videos, whatever I end up doing. If you've got any thoughts about these reviews and my comparisons in this particular video, then please leave a comment, and I'll be back soon with some summary videos just to finally round off this series. Thanks very much for watching this video, and I'll see you next time.